I rise to oppose this deeply flawed budget that is terrible for America and particularly harmful to working families. The Republican plan that we face today is a budget-busting first step towards issuing massive tax breaks to special interests and to wealthy individuals. This proposed budget fails to improve economic growth or to drive up wages. And it should look awfully familiar to all of us because it's a retread of the failed trickle-down economics that exploded our budget deficits in the 1980s and squandered the budget surplus we had briefly in the early 2000s. That trickle-down theory ruined our budgets and failed to grow the economy then, and we cannot afford to relive those failed policies now. Our nation faces significant economic challenges today that need to be addressed directly. Wages have barely improved in the past 20 years. The costs of education, of child care, and other essential living expenses continue to climb. And job creation is slowing. From February through September of this year, the economy added the lowest number of jobs in 7 years. Wages are also falling this year, and since the Trump administration took over, 39 states and the District of Columbia have seen workers' wages decline after adjusting for inflation. Nearly 4 in 10 rural families don't have access to high-speed internet and the opportunities that it affords. We all know that many of the communities we represent in both rural and urban areas still have not fully recovered from the Great Recession. Yet this budget only makes life harder for working families by cutting vital programs and critical services that invest directly in those communities. The Republican budget ignores our current reality and makes it tougher for American families to afford a college education or access quality health care coverage. As we saw through last week's executive actions, the Trump administration remains singularly focused on taking away health care from 20 million Americans and sabotaging the system for those left. This proposed budget would take us deeper down that destructive path. The Republican 2018 budget cuts more than $5 trillion over the next decade in health care, in education, transportation, medical research, and other critical investments. It slashes Medicaid by $1 trillion, that is a T, $1 trillion, and Medicare by more than $470 billion. When they're done, these budget-busting tax giveaways will leave other federal efforts with a gaping $660 billion hole, bringing our domestic federal investments as a share of our nation's GDP to the lowest levels since the Hoover administration. If you're at home listening, all of that sounds pretty unbelievable. Washington Republicans wouldn't really jeopardize our nation's health care, our educational system, our rural communities, and bust the budget all at the same time, right? Unfortunately, all of that is true when you look at the details of this failing budget. And again, this is all based on a brazen theory that led to the failed and harmful tax policies of the past. The real question that we should be asking now is, how do we improve our communities? How do we grow our economy? And how do we drive up wages for hardworking families? That's what I'm focused on when I look at the budget. Republicans believe that step one should be to take funds out of Medicare, out of education, out of infrastructure, and pull health care away from the working poor. Then step two of their plan is to give all of that money to wealthy political interests under the ruse that regular people someday will be better off because America's elite investing class will have done something spectacular with the money that we just sucked out of our communities. It is truly amazing that this idea continues to resurface, because the promise of wild economic growth and trickle-down benefits has failed to materialize time and time again. What we have found is that working families, rural communities, and others who are robbed to finance this type of plan are the ones who suffer, all to put money into other people's pockets. So who exactly loses in this budget? Well, for starters, Mr. President, senior citizens, who will see Medicare cut $470 billion to be exact. Let me say that again. This Republican budget cuts Medicare to the tune of nearly $500 billion. Children, working families, and people in need of opioid treatment who will be pounded by Medicaid cuts of more than $1 trillion. The Medicaid cuts will lead to millions losing their coverage, unravel the progress that we have made fighting the opioid epidemic, jeopardize mental health coverage, and force many rural hospitals to close. The hit will be especially hard in rural areas where more than 12% of rural hospital revenues come from Medicaid. In New Mexico, Medicaid actually accounts for more than 20% of hospital revenue in rural areas. For seniors, the Medicare and Medicaid cuts together will have devastating consequences. So let's look at one example, at Alzheimer's disease. Medicare and Medicaid together pay for nearly 70% of care for those 65 and older with Alzheimer's. These deep cuts will force families to make a terrible choice between working and caring for their family members. Already, 15% of caregivers to someone with Alzheimer's have left their jobs or retired early in the past year due to their caregiving responsibilities. Cutting Medicare, cutting Medicaid, when Alzheimer's costs are getting higher and no cure is in sight, will saddle individuals and their families with massive costs and hardship. But the devastation that this budget will create does not stop there. More than 8 million students will see their Pell Grants cut by a third. That's right, Republicans want to cut investments in education so that they can give special interests a tax break. These are Americans who are striving for a college degree, who just want a fair shot at opportunity without being crushed by debt. Pell Grants are the primary form of financial aid for so many students, giving them access to education that might otherwise be out of reach. This chart pretty much sums it up, what I've been saying about the priorities that are reflected in this budget. Tax cuts over investments in things like Medicare, Medicaid, education. The picture is pretty clear. They are taking direct investments away from our people, from our communities, and instead giving those dollars away as part of a convoluted plan that leaves the wealthy better off. What is more amazing about this plan is that Republicans have changed budget rules to allow them to add $1.5 trillion to the debt while doing it. For many years, the Conrad rule here in the Senate specifically prohibited reconciliation legislation from increasing the deficit in the first 10 years. It was what reconciliation bills were designed to do, reduce the deficit. Then Republicans repealed that rule in 2015 and threw any illusion of fiscal responsibility out the window. Remember, when Republicans believed in fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets, under President Trump, Republicans barely give these values lip service. And this year's budget goes even further than before to reject fiscal reason. It removes a Senate requirement for the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, to issue a cost estimate a day ahead of votes on the Senate floor, the so-called 28-hour rule. Why? Because they want to hide how fiscally irresponsible these votes are from their constituents and the American people. Finally, the Republican budget assumes far faster growth than the CBO could possibly justify under even the rosiest assumptions. This backwards math says that their budget magically delivers $1.24 trillion in deficit reduction. But according to the Tax Policy Center, the Republican tax plan will reduce revenues by $2.4 trillion over the first 10 years, and another $3.2 trillion in the next 10 years. The actual costs far exceed the Republican estimates. And where do all the tax cuts go? Most of them go to wealthy folks who are doing just fine without them. We don't need to be doling out tax breaks to wealthy trust funders when families in Las Cruces and Gallup in Santa Rosa are struggling to make ends meet, don't have high-speed internet, and haven't gotten a raise in years in some cases. Under this Republican plan, the top 0.1% will receive a tax cut of more than $700,000 a year. It would take a typical household in my state nearly 15 years of work and earning just to match the giveaway being provided to a single wealthy investor under this budget. That's not just wrong, it's downright sickening. Part of this massive benefit to the rich comes from the creation of a special rate for pass-through income of 25%. Now, this plan is designed to help large law firms and hedge funds who, in my mind, don't need a special tax break to further enrich themselves. And millions of working families will actually face higher taxes as a result. Under the Republican plan, nearly 8 million working households will actually see an average tax hike of $794. And $800 may not seem like a lot if you're working on Wall Street, but I can tell you $800 is a lot for people working hard on relatively modest incomes in New Mexico. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, we have seen this movie before. We don't need another bad sequel. This Republican plan delivers higher deficits and fewer community investments. Tax cuts in 1981 and the early 2000s led to less revenue as a share of GDP and higher deficits. The national debt nearly tripled under President Reagan. It nearly doubled under President George W. Bush. And we've also seen the dangers of reckless tax cuts for the wealthy at the state level. In Kansas, Republicans slashed individual rates by more than 20% and abolished taxes on pass-through income. Sound familiar? Since the tax cuts were enacted in 2012, the state's revenue plummeted, and Kansas has buckled under an economy that has trailed the U.S. in job, wage, and economic growth. A recent study finds that for tax cuts to pay for themselves, the economy would have to grow $5 to $6 for every single dollar of cuts. Yet the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation found that tax cuts generate nowhere near that amount. According to them, each dollar of tax cuts would lead to only 4 cents to, at best, $1.25 in new economic activity. The evidence is clear. Large tax cuts for special interests and for the rich simply don't pay for themselves. As we've seen time and time again, trickle-down only works in fake so-called think tank models, not in real life. But rather than rely on disproven theories, we could be investing in what we know actually works, at increasing wages, at accelerating economic growth. Expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, for example, has proven to be effective at increasing the living standards of working families. It effectively raises their wages. Let's strengthen and make fully refundable the child tax credit. Instead of slashing infrastructure spending, as this budget does, we should be investing to prepare our nation to compete. Investing in infrastructure is proven to create good-paying jobs, to stimulate our overall economy. President Trump talked about infrastructure investment incessantly on the campaign trail. Where is that rhetoric today? Where is that commitment today? Sending kids to high-quality pre-K is shown to improve both theirs and, for that matter, their parents' economic outcomes. We need to invest in clean energy because it's cheaper, because it's good for the economy, and because all of our future livelihoods depend on addressing climate change. The renewable energy sector is a place where jobs are growing rapidly in New Mexico, and not just in urban metro areas, but especially in rural communities. We need to invest in federal research and development that has led to the internet, to GPS, to the laser and life-saving medical breakthroughs. We must ensure that startups can access the capital that they need to launch and grow their businesses, whether they're in rural New Mexico or downtown Detroit, Mr. President. And we need to close the digital divide so that every person in America, regardless of zip code, has access to high-speed internet that connects people and communities to financial and educational opportunities. Democrats have a plan to grow the economy, to increase wages, and to improve the lives of folks who work on main streets across this country. Our plan connects people with the opportunities that will exist tomorrow. The Republican plan is very different. It's written by the lobbyists on K Street, with much of the benefit flowing to the investment bankers on Wall Street. Regrettably, Republicans are pursuing the same partisan process with the budget and with tax reform that failed when they tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. The cost of Republican chaos and backward thinking is growing by the day, and this budget will continue that process. We need bipartisan, pragmatic solutions to the challenges that our country faces. And to all of my colleagues, we are asking simply to do what we know works. Let's work across the aisle through regular order to get things done for our constituents. Thank you, Mr. President, and I would yield back.